Emma never expected that an ordinary Friday night would change the way her heart understood love. She had agreed to attend a small gathering at her friend Olivia's house, more out of obligation than excitement. After a long week at the publishing house where she worked as an editor, she wanted nothing more than to curl up with a book and a cup of tea. But Olivia insisted, promising it would be a quiet evening with a handful of friends. Emma agreed, thinking it would be harmless, a few hours of conversation, some music in the background, and maybe a little laughter. She never imagined that someone she had never met before would stand out in such a way that everything around her felt different. The moment she stepped into the softly lit living room, she noticed him, Daniel. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. He wasn't loud or surrounded by a crowd. He stood a little apart, listening more than talking, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He looked as though he belonged there without trying, his presence steady and unshaken by the buzz of voices around him. His quietness wasn't awkward. It was magnetic. Emma noticed how people seemed to lean toward him when he spoke, how his words came measured and thoughtful. Emma tried to ignore the pull, but it was impossible. She found herself stealing glances, wondering why someone she didn't even know felt familiar, like she had been waiting for him without realizing it. She joined conversations, laughed when someone told a story, and accepted a plate of food Olivia handed her, but her thoughts kept circling back to the stranger across the room. Every time she tried to look away, her eyes drifted back to him, as though something inside her wanted to memorize the curve of his smile, the calmness in his expression, the ease of his posture. It was when their eyes finally met that everything shifted. It wasn't a long stare, just a few seconds, but Emma felt it like a quiet thunderclap. His gaze was steady, not piercing, but it held her in place. The noise of the room faded, the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter blurred. And for that small moment, it was just the two of them. Emma's breath caught, and she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her hair, but the echo of that look stayed with her as the evening moved on. Emma found herself near the bookshelf, scanning titles not because she was interested in reading, but because it gave her something to do. Daniel approached, his steps unhurried, his presence calm. He stood beside her, glanced at the shelf, and said softly, "Olivia has a good collection. Do you read often?" His voice was low, warm, carried a certain steadiness that made Emma turn toward him. She smiled, relieved that he had broken the silence between them. "I work in publishing. Reading is part of my life," she replied. It sounded plain, but it was the truth. Daniel nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "That explains why you looked at these books like they were old friends." The comment surprised her. Not because it was clever, but because it was observant. Most people would have made small talk about genres or authors, but Daniel noticed something personal, something simple yet striking. For the first time that evening, Emma felt her guard lower. They began talking first about books, then about the city, and then about how they both loved quiet moments more than crowded nights. It wasn't the kind of conversation filled with big confessions, but it carried a depth she hadn't felt with someone new in years. As the minutes passed, Emma realized she wasn't just talking to Daniel, she was learning him. The way he paused before speaking showed he weighed his words. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about music revealed a softer, more passionate side. She found herself laughing, not out of politeness, but because he genuinely made her smile. And in return, Daniel listened, really listened, as though her words carried value. The night slipped away quickly. Guests began leaving. The soft hum of voices faded, and the living room grew quieter. Emma stood by the doorway, pulling on her coat, ready to thank Olivia and head home. Daniel was across the room again, speaking briefly with someone before looking her way. For a moment, she wondered if he would walk over, if he would say something to hold on to the thread of connection they had woven in such a short time. He didn't. Instead, he offered a small smile, one that reached his eyes, and she felt it like a spark brushing against her skin. She smiled back, her heart pounding with the strange awareness that this night was not ordinary anymore. Something had begun. She didn't know what, she didn't know how, but she knew it was real. On her way home, the city lights blurred through the car window as she replayed the evening in her mind. She thought about his quiet strength, the way his presence felt steady against the noise of the world. She told herself not to overthink it, that it was just one meeting, one conversation. Yet deep inside, she couldn't ignore the truth. There was something about Daniel that was bigger, stronger, and beyond anything she had experienced before. That night, as Emma lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized her heart had shifted. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew she had stepped into a story larger than herself. And sometimes, all it takes is a single glance across a crowded room to begin the kind of journey that changes everything. Days turned into weeks. And what began as a single meeting grew into something Emma could no longer ignore. She hadn't expected to hear from Daniel again. But a few days after Olivia's gathering, he sent her a short message. "I enjoyed talking to you. Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" Simple, polite, yet it carried a weight that made her heart skip. Emma read the line again and again, debating how fast to reply. Then smiled to herself and wrote back, "I'd like that." Their first coffee was at a small shop tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Emma arrived early, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her nerves betrayed her. When Daniel walked in, the same calm presence filled the room. He spotted her, waved lightly, and sat across from her with an ease that made the space feel smaller, warmer. Conversation flowed quickly. They talked about books again, about the city's constant rain, about travel dreams neither had chased yet. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, and by the time they left, Emma felt as though she had known him far longer than a few hours. From that moment, their connection deepened. They began meeting regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for long walks along the waterfront, sometimes just to sit in a park with takeout boxes and talk. Emma noticed how Daniel paid attention to the details, how she liked her tea, how she always carried a notebook in her bag, how her laughter softened when she was truly at ease. And she noticed things about him too, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of responsibility, the way he grew quiet when the subject of family came up, the way his eyes carried both strength and something unspoken. The pull between them was undeniable. Emma felt it in the smallest gestures, the brush of his hand when passing her a cup, the way his gaze lingered a second too long, the softness in his voice when he said her name. These weren't grand declarations, but they were powerful. Every time they parted, she replayed the moments, wondering if he felt the same. But along with the closeness came hesitation. Daniel was not a man who rushed. He held back as if there was a line he refused to cross. Sometimes in the middle of a conversation, his eyes would drift away, and she could see the walls he kept around himself. Emma didn't press. She told herself patience was key, but the more time they spent together, the harder it became to hide her own feelings. She wanted to step closer, yet she sensed he was guarding something. Something heavy that made him retreat when the connection grew too strong. One evening, they walked along the pier, the water reflecting city lights. Emma's hands were tucked into her coat, but her heart raced with every step beside him. The air smelled of salt and wood, and the quiet between them was both comforting and charged. Daniel stopped and leaned against the railing, looking out over the water. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "I wonder if life gives us things we're not ready for." Emma turned toward him, waiting. His words were not casual. They carried weight. He didn't look at her when he spoke again. "I want to let myself. But there are pieces of my life that aren't simple." Her chest tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't a door closed forever. It was a door that opened only halfway. She nodded instead, offering quiet understanding. "We don't always have to be ready," she said softly. Daniel looked at her then, and for a moment the hesitation faded. His eyes were steady, filled with something unspoken, something that lived between them in silence. Emma's breath caught. She felt the truth inside her heart. She was already falling. The weeks after that carried both warmth and ache. They shared more moments that stitched themselves into Emma's memory, sitting in a bookstore for hours, walking under umbrellas while the rain tapped against the fabric, watching the city skyline in silence. Yet every high was shadowed by his restraint. He cared she could feel it, but he held back. As though protecting her from stepping too far, Emma tried to guard herself, but each meeting drew her deeper. The way Daniel listened, the way he remembered her words, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching all of it, left marks on her heart. She began to wonder if love always came like this, not in explosions, but in small pulls that became impossible to resist. One night after dinner, he walked her home. Winter came quietly, coating the city in cold air and pale skies. Emma often stood by her apartment window, watching the snow drift down in soft patterns. But her thoughts were never on the weather. They were on Daniel. He had grown distant, like a tide pulling away from the shore. The texts that once came easily now arrived hours late, sometimes not at all. When they spoke, his voice carried hesitation, and the warmth she had once felt was covered by silence. Emma told herself not to panic, but she knew something was changing. She remembered how things had started, every meeting charged with unspoken energy, every word leaving her lighter. But now, when her phone lit up, her heart raced only to be met with disappointment. Short messages, polite words, nothing like before. Daniel wasn't gone, but he wasn't fully there either. It was as if he had built a wall she couldn't climb. Emma tried to stay patient. She reminded herself that life was complicated, that he carried burdens he never explained. She told herself he wasn't pulling away from her, but from his own struggles. Yet the distance hurt in quiet ways. She missed his steady gaze, his careful words, the comfort of walking beside him without needing to speak. Now, she felt like she was reaching across a space that grew wider each day. One evening, she called him. His voice was gentle, but it lacked the spark she remembered. "I've been busy," he said, the phrase that had become his shield. Emma nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I understand," she whispered, though her chest ached with the weight of it. After they hung up, she sat in the dark, her tea untouched, the silence pressing down harder than his words. The truth was simple. She missed him. Not just his presence, but the way he made her feel like she belonged somewhere, like her heart had finally found a home. Without that, the world felt heavier. At work, she stared at manuscripts without focus. With friends, she smiled and nodded, but her thoughts wandered back to him. The distance wasn't just between their conversations. It lived inside her now, an ache that grew each day. Daniel, on his side, wasn't careless. Emma knew he cared. She saw it in the way he still checked in, even if briefly. She felt it in the pauses during their talks, when his voice softened as though he wanted to say more, but stopped himself. He wasn't cold. He was conflicted. That made it harder. If he had stopped caring, she could have let go. But the truth lingered. He wanted her, yet something inside him held him back. One night, snow fell heavier than usual. Emma walked through the streets, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. She needed air, needed space to think. The city lights blurred in the snowfall. She thought of Daniel, how he had once stood beside her under the rain, how he had smiled at her in ways that said more than words ever could. The memory hurt and comforted her all at once. She reached the waterfront, where the water moved slowly under layers of ice. Wrapping her coat tighter, she leaned on the railing and let her thoughts unravel. She asked herself the question she feared most. What if this is all there is? What if his silence is his answer? What if love isn't about wanting, but about letting go when the other person can't stay? The thought made her eyes sting. But she refused to cry. The days that followed carried the same rhythm. Daniel, close enough to feel, yet far enough to miss. Sometimes he would surprise her with a thoughtful message or a question about her day, and her heart would leap. But just as quickly he would retreat, leaving her wondering if she had imagined the connection at all. It was a constant push and pull, a dance of closeness and distance that left her exhausted. Emma began to notice how much of her energy was spent waiting for his calls, his texts, his time. She hated the way her happiness depended on his presence, yet she couldn't break free. She was already too deep. Daniel wasn't just another person in her life. He had become the part of her day she longed for, even when he gave her only fragments of himself. At times she questioned herself. Maybe she had misread everything. Maybe what felt like love to her was only comfort to him. But then she remembered his words, his steady looks, the way his voice changed when he spoke her name. Those weren't accidents. Those moments were real. And that was what made it unbearable knowing. He felt something too, but couldn't give it fully. One Sunday, Emma found herself at the bookstore, where they once spent hours together. She walked through the aisles, her fingers brushing spines of novels, remembering how Daniel had stood beside her, making quiet comments about titles. The memory played like a film, so vivid that she almost turned, expecting him to be there. But he wasn't. She stood in the empty aisle, her chest heavy, realizing how deeply his absence had rooted itself into her life. That night, she sat by her window again, the snow falling quietly outside. She whispered to herself, as though speaking would make sense of her feelings. Love shouldn't feel like this. But maybe it does when it's real. She thought of Daniel's struggles, of the weight he carried. And she wondered if love was not about demanding, but about enduring even when the distance hurt. And yet, deep inside, fear grew louder. What if patience wasn't enough? What if she waited only to find out he could never give her what she needed? Could she live with half of him when her heart wanted all? The questions hung heavy in the quiet room. Emma pressed her palms against the glass, the cold seeping into her skin, grounding her in the moment. She realized love wasn't the simple warmth she had once imagined. It was complicated, fragile, and at times lonely. Still, even in the ache, one truth remained. She couldn't let go. Daniel's presence, no matter how faint, was still the strongest pull she had ever known. And that was what terrified her the most. Because what if love was waiting, but he never came closer? What if the distance became permanent? What if her heart was tied to someone who would never step fully into her life? Emma didn't know the answers. All she knew was that every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel. And every time she opened them, she felt the distance growing wider. Spring returned to the city, now bringing softer air and skies painted with hints of pink at dusk. Emma felt the change in the season, but not in her heart. The distance with Daniel had stretched through the winter, yet she held on, hoping there would be a moment when everything became clear. That moment came unexpectedly one evening when Daniel asked if they could meet at the waterfront, the place where their words often lingered longer than anywhere else. Emma arrived first. Standing near the railing, as the sun dropped low, scattering light across the water, she watched the ripples shimmer in gold and silver, her heart uneasy. She didn't know if this meeting would bring closeness or an ending, but she knew it mattered. Every step with Daniel had carried weight, and this one felt heavier than all the rest. When Daniel arrived, his expression was calm, but his eyes gave him away. There was something in them, tiredness, honesty, and a quiet pain. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, and when he reached her side, he didn't speak right away. They stood together, listening to the water, to the distant hum of the city. The silence was not empty. It was full of the words waiting to be said. Finally, Daniel turned to her, his voice steady but low. Emma, I need to tell you the truth. What I feel for you, it's bigger, stronger, and beyond anything I've ever known. Being with you feels right in ways I can't explain. But the other truth is, my life isn't simple. There are responsibilities I can't step away from, things I can't change right now. And I don't know if it's fair to pull you deeper into something I may not be able to give fully. The words cut deep, yet they were not cruel. They were raw and honest. Emma's chest ached, but she held his gaze. She had suspected his struggles, had felt them in the distance. But hearing them spoken out loud still hurt. She swallowed hard, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel, I don't need perfect. I just need real, and you are real to me. He shook his head slightly, his eyes closing for a moment before opening again. But what if real isn't enough? You deserve someone who can give you every part of himself, not just pieces. I don't want you waiting for something I can't promise. Emma felt tears press at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she reached for his hand, holding it tightly. The warmth of his palm against hers was steady, grounding her in the moment. Love doesn't always come at the right time, she whispered. But when it does, we don't ignore it. We honor it, even if it hurts. Daniel's eyes softened, and for the first time, his guard seemed to break. He looked at her as though memorizing her, as though every detail mattered. His silence spoke of longing, of love that was present but trapped by circumstances neither could control. They stood like that for a long time. Her hand in his, the world around them moving on. The sound of waves filled the pauses between their breaths. Emma realized then that love was not always about winning or keeping. Sometimes, love was about recognizing its truth, even when it couldn't stay the way you wished it would. Daniel's voice came again, softer this time. "You've changed me, Emma. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'll never forget what you've given me. You've reminded me what it feels like to feel alive again." Her heart broke at the beauty and the ache of his words. She squeezed his hand, her own voice trembling. "And you've shown me that love isn't measured by time. It's measured by how deeply it touches us." The sun had slipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange fading into purple.